Hi, it's story time again. Are you ready for another tale? Wonderful. Well, if you settle down, close your eyes and listen, and I will read for you A Case of Trespass. It was in the forenoon of a hazy, breathless day, and Dan Phillips was trouting up one of the back creeks of the Carlton Pond. It was somewhat cooler up the creek than out on the main body of water, for the tall birches and willows, crowding down to the brim, threw cool, green shadows across it, and shut out the scorching glare, while a stray breeze now and then rippled down the wooded slopes, rustling the beech leaves with an airy, pleasant sound. Out in the pond the glassy water creamed and shimmered in the hot sun, unrippled by the faintest breeze of air. Across the soft, pearly tints of the horizon blurred the smoke of the big factory chimneys that were owned by Mr. Walters, to whom the pond and adjacent property also belonged. Mr. Walters was a comparative stranger in Carlton, having but recently purchased the factories from the heirs of the previous owner. But he had been in charge long enough to establish a reputation for sternness and inflexibility in all his business dealings. One or two of his employees, who had been discharged by him on what they deemed insufficient ground, helped to deepen the impression that he was an unjust and arbitrary man, merciless to all offenders and intolerant of the slightest infringement of his cast iron rules. Dan Phillips had been on the pond ever since sunrise. The trout had risen well in the early morning, but as the day wore on, growing hotter and hotter, they refused to bite, and for half an hour Dan had not caught one. He had a goodly string of them already, however, and he surveyed them with satisfaction as he rowed his leaky little skiff to the shore of the creek. "Pretty good catch," he soliloquized. "Best I've had this summer so far. That big spotted one must weigh near a pound. She's a beauty. They're a good price over at the hotels now, too. I'll go home and get my dinner and go straight over with them. That'll leave me time for another try at them about sunset. Phew, how hot it is. I must take Ella May home a bunch of them blue flags. They're real handsome." He tied his skiff under the crowding alders, gathered a big bunch of the purple flag lilies with their silky petals, and started homeward, whistling cheerily as he stepped briskly along the fern-carpeted wood path that wound up the hill under the beeches and firs. He was a freckled, sunburned lad of 13 years. His neighbours all said that Danny was as smart as a steel trap, and immediately added that they wondered where he got his smartness from. Certainly not from his father. The elder Phillips had been denominated shiftless and slack-twisted by all who had ever had any dealings with him in his unlucky, aimless life. One of those improvident, easy-going souls who sit contentedly down to breakfast with a very faint idea where their dinner is to come from. When he had died, no one had missed him, unless it were his patient, sad-eyed wife, who bravely faced her lot and toiled unremittingly to keep a home for her 2 children, Dan and a girl 2 years younger, who was suffering from some form of spinal disease. Dan, who was old and steady for his years, had gone manfully to work to assist his mother. Though he had been disappointed in all his efforts to obtain steady employment, he was active and obliging, and earned many a small amount by odd jobs around the village, and by helping the Carlton farmers in planting and harvest. For the last 2 years, however, his most profitable source of summer income had been the trout pond. The former owner had allowed anyone who wished to fish in his pond to do so, and Dan made a regular business of it, selling his trout at the big hotels over at Mosquito Lake. This, in spite of its unattractive name, was a popular summer resort, and Dan always found a ready market for his catch. When Mr. Walters purchased the property, it somehow never occurred to Dan that the new owner might not be so complacent as his predecessor in the matter of the best trouting pond in the country. To be sure, Dan often wondered why it was the pond was so deserted this summer. He could not recall having seen a single person on it, save himself. Still, it did not cross his mind that there could be any particular reason for this. He always fished up in the cool, dim creeks, which long experience had taught him were best for trout, and came and went by a convenient wood path. But he had no thought of concealment in doing so. He would not have cared had all Carlton seen him. He had done very well with his fish so far, and prices for trout at the lake went up every day. Dan was an enterprising boy, and a general favourite with the hotel owners. They knew that he could always be depended on. Mrs. Phillips met him at the door when he reached home. "See, Mother," said Dan exultantly as he held up his fish. "Just look at that fellow, will you? £1 if he's an ounce. I ought to get a good price for these, I can tell you. Let me have my dinner now, and I'll go right over to the lake with them." "It's a long walk for you, Danny," replied his mother pityingly, "and it's too hot to go so far. I'm afraid you'll get sunstruck or something. You'd better wait till the cool of the evening. You're looking real pale and thin this while back." "Oh, I'm all right, Mother," assured Dan cheerfully. "I don't mind the heat a bit. A fellow must put up with some inconveniences. Wait till I bring home the money for these fish, and I mean to have another catch tonight. It's you that's looking tired. I wish you didn't have to work so hard, Mother. If I could only get a good place, you could take it much easier. Sam French says that Mr. Walters wants a boy up there at the factory, but I know I won't do. I ain't big enough. Perhaps something will turn up soon, though. When our ship comes in, Mother, we'll have good times." He picked up his flags and went to the little room where his sister lay. "See what I brought you, Ella May," he said, as he thrust the cool, moist clusters into her thin, eager hands. "Did you ever see such beauties?" "Oh, Dan, how lovely they are. Thank you ever so much. If you're going over to the lake this afternoon, will you please call at Mrs. Henry's and get those nutmeg geranium slips she promised me? Just look how nice my others are growing. The pink one is going to bloom. I'll bring you all the geranium slips at the lake if you like. When I get rich, Ella May, I'll build you a big conservatory, and I'll get every flower in the world in it for you. You shall just live and sleep among posies. Is dinner ready, Mother? Trouting's hungry work, I tell you. What paper is this?" He picked up a folded newspaper from the table. "Oh, that's only an old lake advertiser," answered Mrs. Phillips, as she placed the potatoes on the table and wiped her moist, hot face with the corner of her gingham apron. "Letty Mills brought it in around a parcel this morning. It's 4 weeks old, but I kept it to read if I ever get time. It's so seldom we see a paper of any kind nowadays, but I haven't looked at it yet. Why, Danny, what on earth is the matter?" For Dan, who opened the paper and glanced over the first page, suddenly gave a choked exclamation and turned pale, staring stupidly at the sheet before him. "See, Mother," he gasped as she came up in alarm and looked over his shoulder. This is what they read. "Notice: anyone found fishing on my pond at Carlton after date will be prosecuted according to the law without respect of persons. June 1st. H. C. Walters." "Oh, Danny, what does it mean?" Danny went and carefully closed the door of Ella May's room before he replied. His face was pale and his voice shaky. "Mean? Well, Mother, it means that I've been stealing Mr. Walter's trout all summer. Stealing them. That's what it means." "Oh, Danny, but you didn't know." "No, but I ought to have remembered that he was the new owner and have asked him. I never thought. Mother, what does prosecuted according to law mean? I don't know, I'm sure, Danny. If this is so, there's only one thing to be done. You must go straight to Mr. Walters and tell him all about it. Mother, I don't dare to. He's a dreadfully hard man. Sam French's father says I wouldn't believe a word Sam French's father says about Mr. Walters, said Mrs. Phillips firmly. He's got a spite against him because he was dismissed. Besides, Danny, it's the only right thing to do. You know that. We're poor, but we have never done anything underhand yet. Yes, Mother, I know, said Dan, gulping his fear bravely down. I'll go, of course, right after dinner. I was only scared at first. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll clean these trout nicely and take them to Mr. Walters and tell him that if he'll only give me time, I'll pay him back every cent of money I've got for all I've sold this summer. Then maybe he'll let me off, seeing as I didn't know about the notice. I'll go with you, Danny. No, I'll go alone, Mother. You don't need to go with me, said Dan heroically. To himself he said that his mother had troubles enough. He would never subject her to the added ordeal of an interview with the stern factory owner. He would beard the lion in his den himself if it had to be done. Don't tell Ella May anything about it. It would worry her. And don't cry, Mother. I guess it'll be all right. Let me have my dinner now, and I'll go straight off. Dan ate his dinner rapidly. Then he carefully cleaned his trout, put them in a long basket with rhubarb leaves over them, and started with an assumed cheerfulness very far from his real feelings. He had barely passed the gate when another boy came shuffling along, a tall, raw-boned lad with an insinuating smile and shifty, cunning eyes. The newcomer nodded familiarly to Dan. Hello, Sonny. Going over to the lake with your catch, are you? You'll fry up before you get there. There'll be nothing left of you but a crisp. I'm not going to the lake. I'm going to the factory to see Mr. Walters. Sam French gave a long whistle of surprise. Why, Dan? What's taking you there? You surely ain't thinking of trying for that place, are you? Walters wouldn't look at you. Why, he wouldn't take me. You haven't the ghost of a chance. I'm not going for that. Sam, did you know that Mr. Walters had a notice in the Lake Advertiser that nobody could fish in his pond this summer? Of course I did, the old skinflint. He's too mean to live, that's what. He never goes near the pond himself. Regular dog in the manger he is. Dad says, Sam, why didn't you tell me about that notice? Gracious, didn't you know? I supposed everybody did. And here I've been taking you for the cutest chap this side of sunset, fishing away in that creek where no one could see you, and cutting through the woods on the sly. You don't mean to tell me you never saw that notice? No, I didn't. Do you think I'd have gone near the pond if I had? I never saw it till today, and I'm going straight to Mr. Walters now to tell him about it. Sam French stopped short in the dusty road and stared at Dan in undisguised amazement. Dan Phillips, he ejaculated. Have you plumb gone out of your mind? Boy alive, you needn't be afraid they'll peach on you. I'm too blamed glad to see anyone get the better of that old Walters, smart as he thinks himself. Gee, to dream of going to him and telling him you've been fishing in his pond. Why, he'll put you in jail. You don't know what sort of man he is. Dad says, never mind what your dad says, Sam. My mind's made up. Dan, you chump. That notice says prosecuted according to law. Why, Danny, he'll put you in prison, or fine you, or something dreadful. I can't help it if he does, said Dan stoutly. You get out of here, Sam French, and don't be trying to scare me. I mean to be honest, and how can I be if I don't own up to Mr. Walters that I've been stealing his trout all summer? Stealing fiddlesticks. Dan, I used to think you were a chap with some sense, but I see I was mistaken. You ain't done no harm. Walters will never miss them trout. If you're so dreadful squeamish that you won't fish no more, why, you needn't. But just let the matter drop and hold your tongue about it. That's my advice. Well, it isn't my mother's then. I mean to go by hers. You needn't argue no more, Sam. I'm going. Go then, said Sam, stopping short in disgust. You're a big fool, Dan, and serve you right if Walter lands you off to jail. But I don't wish you no ill. If I can do anything for your family after you're gone, I will, and I'll try and give your remains Christian burial, if there's any remains. So long, Danny. Give my love to old Walters. Danny was not greatly encouraged by this interview. He shrank more than ever from the thought of facing the stern factory owner. His courage had almost evaporated when he entered the office of the factory and asked shakily for Mr. Walters. He's in his office there, replied the clerk. But he's very busy. Better leave your message with me. I must see Mr. Walters himself, please, said Dan firmly, but with inward trepidation. The clerk swung himself impatiently from his stool and ushered Dan into Mr. Walters' private office. Boy to see you, sir, he said briefly, as he closed the ground glass door behind him. Dan, dizzy and trembling, stood in the dreaded presence. Mr. Walters was writing at a table covered with a business-like litter of papers. He laid down his pen and looked up with a frown as the clerk vanished. He was a stern-looking man, with deep-set grey eyes and a square, clean-shaven chin. There was not an ounce of superfluous flesh on his frame, and his voice and manner were those of the decided, resolute, masterful man of business. He pointed to a capacious leather chair and said concisely, "What is your business with me, boy?" Dan had carefully thought out the statement of facts beforehand, but every word had vanished from his memory. He had only a confused, desperate consciousness that he had a theft to confess, and that must be done as soon as possible. He did not sit down. "Please, Mr. Walters," he began desperately, "I came to tell you. Your notice. I never saw it before. I've been fishing in your pond all summer, but I didn't know, honest. I thought you were all I caught today, and I'll pay you back for them all, sometime." An amused, puzzled expression crossed Mr. Walters' non-committal face. He pushed the leather chair forward. "Sit down, my boy," he said kindly. "I don't quite understand this somewhat mixed-up statement of yours. You've been fishing in my pond, you say. Didn't you see my notice in the advertiser?" Dan sat down more composedly. The revelation was over, and he was still alive. "No, sir. We hardly ever see an advertiser, and nobody told me. I'd always been used to fishing there, and I never thought for what it was all right to keep on. I know I ought to have remembered to ask you, but truly, sir, I didn't mean to steal your fish. I used to sell them over at the hotels. We saw the notice today, Mother and me, and I came right up. I brought you the trout I caught this morning, and if only you won't prosecute me, sir, I'll pay back every cent I got for the others. Every cent, sir, if you'll give me time." Mr. Walters passed his hand across his mouth to conceal something like a smile. "Your name is Dan Phillips, isn't it?" he said irrelevantly. "And you live with your mother, the widow Phillips, down there at Carlton Corners, I understand." "Yes, sir," said Dan, wondering how Mr. Phillips knew so much about him, and if these were the preliminaries of prosecution. Mr. Walters took up his pen and drew a blank sheet towards him. "Well, Dan, I put that notice in because I found that many people who used to fish on my pond, irrespective of leave or license, were accustomed to lunch or camp on my property, and did not a little damage. I don't care for trout myself. I've no time for it. However, I hardly think you'll do much damage. You can keep on fishing there. I'll give you a written permission, so that if any of my men see you, they won't interfere with you. As for these trout here, I'll buy them from you at Lake Mosquito prices, and will say no more about the matter. How will that do?" "Thank you, sir," stammered Dan. He could hardly believe his ears. He took the slip of paper Mr. Walters handed to him and rose to his feet. "Wait a minute, Dan. How was it you came to tell me this? You might have stopped your depredations, and I should not have been any the wiser." "That would not have been honest, sir," said Dan, looking squarely at him. There was a brief silence. Mr. Walters thrummed meditatively on the table. Dan waited wonderingly. Finally, the factory owner said abruptly, "There's a vacant place for a boy down there. I want it filled as soon as possible. Will you take it?" "Mr. Walters? Me?" Dan thought the world must be turning upside down. "Yes, you. You are rather young, but the duties are not hard or difficult to learn. I think you'll do." I was resolved not to fill that place until I could find a perfectly honest and trustworthy boy for it. I believe I have found him. I discharged the last boy because he lied to me about some trifling offence, for which I would have forgiven him if he had told the truth. I can bear with incompetency, but falsehood and deceit I cannot and will not tolerate," he said, so sternly that Dan's face paled. "I am convinced that you are incapable of either. Will you take the place, Dan?" "I will, if you think I can fill it, sir. I will do my best." "Yes, I believe you will. Perhaps I know more about you than you think. Businessmen must keep their eyes open. We'll regard this matter as settled then. Come up tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And one more word, Dan. You have perhaps heard that I am an unjust and hard master. I am not the former, and you will never have occasion to find me the latter if you are always as truthful and straightforward as you have been today. You might easily have deceived me in this matter. That you did not do so is the best and only recommendation I require. Take those trout up to my house and leave them. That will do. Good afternoon." Dan somehow got his dazed self through the glassed door and out of the building. The whole interview had been such a surprise to him that he was hardly sure whether or not he had dreamed it after all. "I feel as if I were some person else," he said to himself as he started down the hot, white road. But Mother was right. I'll stick to her motto. I wonder what Sam will say to this. The Story of an Invitation. Bertha Sutherland hurried home from the post office and climbed the stairs of her boarding house to her room on the 3rd floor. Her roommate, Grace Maxwell, was sitting on the divan by the window, looking out into the twilight. A year ago, Bertha and Grace had come to Dartmouth to enter the academy and found themselves roommates. Bertha was bright, pretty and popular, the favourite of her classmates and teachers. Grace was a grave, quiet girl, dressed in mourning. She was quite alone in the world, the aunt who had brought her up having recently died. At first she had felt shy with bright and brilliant Bertha, but they soon became friends. and the year that followed was a very pleasant one. It was almost ended now, for the terminal exams had begun, and in a week's time the school could close for the holidays. "Have some chocolates, Grace," said Bertha. "I've got such good news in my letter tonight that I felt I must celebrate it fittingly. So I went into Carter's and invested all my spare cash in caramels. It's really fortunate the term is almost out, for I'm nearly bankrupt. I have just enough left to furnish a dugout for commencement night, and no more." "What is your good news, may I ask?" said Grace. "You know I have an Aunt Margaret, commonly called Aunt Meg, out at Riversdale, don't you? There never was such a dear, sweet, jolly auntie in the world. I had a letter from her tonight. Listen, I'll read you what she says. I want you to spend your holidays with me, my dear. Mary Fairweather and Louise Fish and Lily Dennis are coming too, so there is just room for one more, and that one must be yourself. Come to Riversdale when school closes, and I'll feed you on strawberries and cream and pound cake and doughnuts and mince pies and all the delicious, irresistible things that schoolgirls love and careful mothers condemn. Mary and Lou and Lil are girls after your own heart, I know, and you shall all do just as you like, and we'll have picnics and parties and merry doings galore." "There," said Bertha, looking up with a laugh. "Isn't that just lovely? How delightful it must be to have friends like that to love you and plan for you," said Grace wistfully. "I'm sure you will have a pleasant vacation, Bertie. As for me, I'm going into Clarkman's bookstore until school reopens. I saw Mr. Clarkman today, and he agreed to take me." Bertha looked surprised. She had not known what Grace's vacation plans were. "I don't think you ought to do that, Grace," she said thoughtfully. "You are not strong, and you need a good rest. It will be awfully trying to work at Clarkman's all summer." "There is nothing else for me to do," said Grace, trying to speak cheerfully. "You know I'm as poor as the proverbial church mouse, Bertie, and the simple truth is that I can't afford to pay my board all summer and get my winter outfit unless I do something to earn it. I shall be too busy to be lonesome, and I shall expect long, newsy letters from you, telling me all your fun, passing your vacation on to me at second hand, you see. Well, I must set to work at all those algebra problems. I tried them before dark, but I couldn't solve them. My head ached, and I felt so stupid. How glad I shall be when exams are over. I suppose I must revise that senior English this evening, said Bertha absently. But she made no move to do so. She was studying her friend's face. How very thin and pale Grace looked. Surely much paler and thinner than when she came to the academy, and she had not by any means been plump and rosy then. I believe she could not stand 2 months at Clarkman's, thought Bertha. If I were not going to Aunt Meg's, I would ask her to go home with me, or even if Aunt Meg had room for another guest. I'll just write her all about Grace and ask her if I could bring her with me. Aunt Meg would understand. She always understands. But she hasn't, so it can't be. Then a thought darted into Bertha's brain. What nonsense, she said aloud, so suddenly and forcibly that Grace fairly jumped. What is it? Oh, nothing much, said Bertha, getting up briskly. See here, I'm going to get to work. I've wasted enough time. She curled herself up on the divan and tried to study her senior English, but her thoughts wandered hopelessly, and finally she gave it up in despair and went to bed. There she could not sleep. She lay awake and wrestled with herself. It was after midnight when she sat up in bed and said solemnly, I will do it. Next day Bertha wrote a confidential letter to Aunt Meg. She thanked her for her invitation and then told her all about Grace. And what I want to ask Aunt Meg is that you will let me transfer my invitation to Grace and ask her to go to Riversdale this summer in my place. Don't think me ungrateful. No, I'm sure you won't. You always understand things. But you can't have us both, and I'd rather Grace should go. It will do her so much good, and I have a lovely home of my own to go to, and she has none. Aunt Meg understood as usual and was perfectly willing, so she wrote to Bertha and enclosed a note of invitation for Grace. I shall have to manage this affair very carefully, reflected Bertha. Grace must never suspect that I did it on purpose. I will tell her that circumstances have prevented me from accepting Aunt Meg's invitation. That is true enough. No need to say that those circumstances are hers, not mine. And I'll say I just asked Aunt Meg to invite her in my place, and that she has done so. When Grace came home from her history examination that day, Bertha told her story and gave her Aunt Meg's cordial note. You must come to me in Bertha's place, wrote the latter. I feel as if I knew you from her letters, and I will consider you a sort of honorary niece, and I'll treat you as if you were Bertha herself. Isn't it splendid of Aunt Meg? Said Bertha diplomatically. Of course you'll go, Gracie. Oh, I don't know, said Grace in bewilderment. Are you sure you don't want to go, Bertha? Indeed I want to go, dreadfully, said Bertha frankly. But as I've told you, it is impossible. But if I am disappointed, Aunt Meg mustn't be. You must go, Grace. That is all there is about it. At the end, Grace did go, a little puzzled and doubtful still, but thankful beyond words to escape the drudgery of the counter and the noise and heat of the city. Bertha went home, feeling a little bit blue in secret, it cannot be denied, but also feeling quite sure that if she had to do it all over again, she would do just the same. The summer slipped quickly by, and finally 2 letters came to Bertha, one from Aunt Meg and one from Grace. "I've had a lovely time," wrote the latter, "and oh, Bertie, what do you think? I am to stay here always. Oh, of course, I'm going back to school next month, but this is to be my home after this. Aunt Meg, she makes me call her that, says I must stay with her for good." In Aunt Meg's letter was this paragraph: "Grace is writing to you, and will have told you that I intend to keep her here. You know I have always wanted a daughter of my own, but my greedy brothers and sisters would never give me one of theirs, so I intend to adopt Grace. She is the sweetest girl in the world, and I am very grateful to you for sending her here. You will not know her when you see her. She has grown rosy and plump." Bertha folded her letters up with a smile. "I have a vague and delightful feeling that I am the good angel in a storybook," she said. In spite of myself. My trunk was packed, and I had arranged with my senior partner. I was the junior member of a law firm, for a month's vacation. Aunt Lucy had written that her husband had gone on a sea trip, and she wished me to superintend the business of his farm and mills in his absence, if I could arrange to do so. She had added that Gussie thought it a pity to trouble me, and wanted to do the overseeing herself, but that she, Aunt Lucy, preferred to have a man at the head of the affairs. I had never seen my step-cousin, Augusta Ashley, but I knew from Aunt Lucy's remarks concerning her pretty much what sort of person she was. Just the precise kind I disliked immeasurably. I had no idea what her age was, but doubtless she was over 30, tall, determined, aggressive, with a faculty for managing, a sharp, probing nose, and a Y formation between her eyebrows. I knew the type, and I was assured that the period of sojourn with my respected aunt would be one of strife between Miss Ashley and myself. I wrote to Aunt Lucy to expect me, made all necessary arrangements, and went to bid Nellie good-bye. I had made up my mind to marry Nellie. I had never openly avowed myself her suitor, but we were cousins and had grown up together, so that I knew her well enough to be sure of my ground. I liked her so well that it was easy to persuade myself that I was in love with her. She more nearly fulfilled the requirements of my ideal wife than anyone I knew. She was pleasant to look upon without being distractingly pretty, small and fair and womanly. She dressed nicely, sang and played agreeably, danced well, and had a cheerful, affectionate disposition. She was not alarmingly clever, had no hobbies, and looked up to me as heir to all the wisdom of the ages. What man does not like to be thought clever and brilliant? I had no formidable rival, and our families were anxious for the match. I considered myself a lucky fellow. I thought that I would be very lonely without Nellie when I was away, and she admitted frankly that she would miss me awfully. She looked so sweet that I was on the point of asking her then and there to marry me. Well, fate interfered in the guise of a small brother, so I said goodbye and left, mentally comparing her to my idea of Miss Augusta Ashley, much to the latter's disadvantage. When I stepped from the train at a sleepy country station next day, I was promptly waylaid by a black-eyed urchin who informed me that Mrs. Ashley had sent him with an express wagon for my luggage, and that Miss Gussie was awaiting with the carriage at the store, pointing down to a small building before whose door a girl was trying to soothe her frightened horse. As I went down the slope towards her, I noticed she was tall, quite too tall for my taste. I dislike women who can look into my eyes on a level, but I had to admit that her form was remarkably symmetrical and graceful. She put out her hand. It was ungloved and large, but white and firm, with a cool, pleasant touch, and said, with a composure akin to indifference, "Mr. Carslake, I presume? Mother could not come to meet you, so she sent me. Will you be kind enough to hold my horse for a few minutes? I want to get something in the store." Whereupon she calmly transferred the reins to me and disappeared. At the time she certainly did not impress me as pretty, yet neither could I call her plain. Taken separately, her features were good. Her nose was large and straight, the mouth also a trifle large, but firm and red, the brow wide and white, shadowed by a straying dash of brown curl or two. She had a certain cool, statuesque paleness, accentuated by straight, fine black brows, and her eyes were a bluish grey, but the pupils, as I afterward found out, had a trick of dilating into wells of blackness, which added to a long fringe of very dark lashes, made her eyes quite the most striking feature of her face. Her expression was open and frank, and her voice clear and musical. without being sweet. She looked about 22. At the time, I did not fancy her appearance, and made a mental note to the effect that I would never like Miss Ashley. I had no use for cool, business-like women. Women should have no concern with business. Nellie would never have troubled her dear, curly head over it. Miss Ashley came out with her arms full of packages, stowed them away in the carriage, got in and told me which road to take, and did not again speak till we were out of the village and driving along the pretty country lane, arched over with crimson maples and golden brown beeches. The purplish haze of a sunny autumn day mellowed over the fields, and the bunch of goldenrod at my companion's belt was akin to the plumed ranks along the fences. I hazarded the remark that it was a fine day. Miss Ashley gravely admitted that it was. Then a deep smile seemed to rise somewhere in her eyes and creep over her face, discovering a dimple here and there as it proceeded. "Don't let's talk about the weather. The subject is rather stale," she said. "I suppose you are wondering why on earth Mother had to drag you away out here." I tried to show her how foolish it was, but I didn't succeed. Mother thinks there must be a man at the head of affairs, or they'll never go right. I could have taken full charge easily enough. I haven't been Father's boy all my life for nothing. There was no need to take you away from your business. I protested. I said I was going to take a vacation anyway, and business was not pressing just then. I also hinted that, while I had no doubt of her capacity, she might have found the duties of the superintendent rather arduous. "Not at all," she said, with a serenity that made me groan inwardly. "I like it. Father always said I was born a business manager. You'll find Ashley's Mills very quiet, I'm afraid. It's a sort of charmed Sleepy Hollow. See, there's home." As we turned a maple blazoned corner and looked from the crest of one hill across to that of another. Home was a big, white, green-shuttered house, buried amid a riot of autumn colour, with a big grove of dark green spruces at the back. Below them was a glimpse of dark blue mill pond, and beyond it long sweeps of golden brown meadowland, sloping up till they dimmed in horizon mists of pearl and purple. "How pretty!" I exclaimed admiringly. "Isn't it?" said Gussie proudly. "I love it." Her pupils dilated into dark pools, and I rather unwillingly admitted that Miss Ashley was a fine-looking girl. As we drove up, Aunt Lucy was standing on the steps of the veranda, over whose white roof trailed a luxuriant creeper, its leaves tinged by October fruits into lovely wine reds and tawny yellows. Gussie sprang out, barely touching my offered hand with her fingertips. "There's Mother waiting to pounce on you and hear all the family news," she said, "so go and greet her like a dutiful nephew." "I must take your horse for you first," I said politely. "Not at all," said Miss Ashley, taking the reins from my hands in a way not to be disputed. "I always unharness Charlie myself. No one else understands him half so well. Besides, I'm used to it. Didn't I tell you I'd always been father's boy?" "I well believe it," I thought in disgust, as she led the horse over to the well and I went up to Aunt Lucy. Through the sitting-room windows I kept a watchful eye on Miss Ashley as she watered and deftly unharnessed Charlie and led him into his stable with sundry pats on his nose. Then I saw no more of her till she came in to tell us tea was ready and led the way out to the dining room. It was evident Miss Gussie held the reins of the household government, and no doubt worthily. Those firm, capable white hands of hers looked as though they might be equal to a good many emergencies. She talked little, leaving the conversation to Aunt Lucy and myself, though occasionally dropped in an apt word. Toward the end of the meal, however, she caught hold of an unfortunate opinion I incautiously advanced and tore it into tatters. The result was a spirited argument in which Miss Gussie held her own with such ability that I was utterly routed and found another grievance against her. It was very humiliating to be worsted by a girl, a country girl at that, who had passed most of her life on a farm. No doubt she was strong-minded and wanted to vote. I was quite prepared to believe anything of her. After tea, Miss Ashley proposed a walk around the premises in order to initiate me into my duties. Apart from his farm, Mr. Ashley owned large grist and sawmills and did a flourishing business, with the details of which Miss Gussie seemed so conversant that I lost all doubt of her ability to run the whole thing as she claimed. I felt quite ignorant in the light of her superior knowledge, and our walk was enlivened by some rather too lively discussions between us. We walked about together, however, till the shadows of the firs by the mills stretched nearly across the pond, and the white moon began to put on a silvery burnish. Then we wound up by a bitter dispute, during which Gussie's eyes were very black, and each cheek had a round red stain on it. She had a little air of triumph at having defeated me. "I have to go now and see about putting away the milk, and I dare say you're not sorry to be rid of me," she said, with a demureness I had not credited her with. "But if you come to the veranda in half an hour, I'll bring you out a glass of new milk and some pound cake I made today by a recipe that's been in the family for 100 years, and I hope it will choke you for all the snubs you've been giving me." She walked away after this amiable wish, and I stood by the pond till the salmon tints faded from its waters and stars began to mirror themselves brokenly in its ripples. The mellow air was full of sweet, mingled evening tide sounds as I walked back to the house. Aunt Lucy was knitting on the veranda. Gussie brought out cake and milk and chatted to us while we ate in an inconsequent girlish way, or fed bits of cake to a green-eyed goblin in the likeness of a black cat. She appeared in such an amiable light that I was half inclined to reconsider my opinion of her. When I went to my room, the vase of full crimson leaves on my table suggested Gussie, and I repented of my unfriendliness for a moment, and only for a moment. Gussie and her mother passed through the hall below, and Aunt Lucy's soft voice floated up through my half-open door. "Well, how do you like your cousin, my dear?" Whereat that decided young lady promptly answered, "I think he is the most conceited youth I've met for some time." Pleasant, wasn't it? I thought of Nellie's meek admiration of all my words and ways, and got her photo out to soothe my vanity. For the first time it struck me that her features were somewhat insipid. The thought seemed like disloyalty, so I banished it and went to bed. I expected to dream of that disagreeable Gussie, but I did not, and I slept so soundly that it was 10 o'clock the next morning before I awoke. I sprang out of bed in dismay, dressed hastily, and ran down, not a little provoked at myself. Through the window I saw Gussie in the garden, digging up some geraniums. She was enveloped in a clay-stained brown apron. A big, flapping straw hat half hid her face, and she wore a pair of muddy old kid gloves. Her whole appearance was disreputable, and the face she turned to me as I said good morning had a diagonal streak of clay across it. I added slovenliness to my already long list of her demerits. "Good afternoon, rather. Don't you know what time it is? The men were here 3 hours ago for their orders. I thought it a pity to disturb your peaceful dreams, so I gave them myself and sent them off." I was angrier than ever. A nice beginning I had made, and was that girl laughing at me? "I expected to be called in time, certainly," I said stiffly. "I am not accustomed to oversleep myself. I promise it will not occur again." my dignity was quite lost on Gussie. She peeled off her gloves cheerfully and said, "I suppose you'd like some breakfast. Just wait till I wash my hands and I'll get you some. Then, if you're pining to be useful, you can help me take up these geraniums." There was no help for it. After I had breakfast, I went with many misgivings. We got on fairly well, however. Gussie was particularly lively and kept me too busy for argument. I quite enjoyed the time, and we did not quarrel until nearly the last, when we fell out bitterly over some horticultural problem and went into dinner in sulky silence. Gussie disappeared after dinner, and I saw no more of her. I was glad of this, but after a time I began to find it a little dull. Even a dispute would have been livelier. I visited the mills, looked over the farm, and then carelessly asked Aunt Lucy where Miss Ashley was. Aunt Lucy replied that she had gone to visit a friend and would not be back till the next day. This was satisfactory, of course, highly so. What a relief it was to be rid of that girl with her self-assertiveness and independence. I said to myself that I hoped her friend would keep her for a week. I forgot to be disappointed that she had not, when, next afternoon, I saw Gussie coming in at the gate with a tolerably large satchel and an arm full of goldenrod. I sauntered down to relieve her, and we had a sharp argument under way before we were halfway up the lane. As usual, Gussie refused to give in that she was wrong. Her walk had brought a faint, clear tint to her cheeks, and her rippling, dusky hair had half slipped down her neck. She said she had to make some cookies for tea, and if I had nothing better to do, I might go and talk to her while she mixed them. It was not a gracious invitation, but I went rather than be left to my own company. By the end of the week, I was as much at home at Ashley Mills as if I had lived there all my life. Gussie and I were thrown together a good deal for lack of other companions, and I saw no reason to change my opinion of her. She could be lively and entertaining when she chose, and at times she might be called beautiful. Still, I did not approve of her. At least I thought so, most of the time. Once in a while came a state of feeling which I did not quite understand. One evening I went to prayer meeting with Aunt Lucy and Gussie. I had not seen the minister of Ashley Mills before, though Gussie and her mother seemed to know him intimately. I had an idea that he was old and silvery-haired and benevolent-looking, so I was rather surprised to find him as young as myself, tall, pale, intellectual-looking man with a high white brow and dark, earnest eyes, decidedly attractive. I was still more surprised when, after the service, he joined Gussie at the door and went down the steps with her. I felt distinctly ill-treated as I fell back with Aunt Lucy. There was no reason why I should. None. It ought to have been a relief. Reverend Carroll Martin had every right to see Miss Ashley home if he chose. Doubtless a girl who knew all there was to be known about business, farming and milling, to say nothing of housekeeping and gardening, could discuss theology also. It was none of my business. Don't know what kept me awake so late that night. As a consequence, I overslept myself. I had managed to redeem my reputation on this point, but here it was lost again. I felt cross and foolish and cantankerous when I went out. There was some unusual commotion at the well. It was an old-fashioned open one with a chain and windlass. Aunt Lucy was peering anxiously down its mouth, from which a ladder was sticking. Just as I got there, Gussie emerged from its depths with a triumphant face. Her skirt was muddy and draggled, her hair had tumbled down, and she held a dripping black cat. Coco must have fallen into the well last night, she explained, as I helped her to the ground. I missed him at milking time, and when I came to the well this morning, I heard the most ear-splitting yowls coming up from it. I couldn't think where he could possibly be, for the water was quite calm, until I saw he had crept into a little crevice in the stones on the side. So I got a ladder and went down after him. "You should have called me," I said sourly. "You might have killed yourself going down there." "And Coco might have tumbled in and drowned while you were getting up," retorted Gussie. "Besides, what was the need? I could go down the well just as you." "No doubt," I said, more sharply than I had any business to. "I don't dream of disputing your ability to do anything you may take it into your head to do. Most young ladies are not in the habit of going down wells, however." "Perhaps not," she rejoined, with freezing calmness. "But as you may have discovered, I am not most young ladies. I am myself, Augusta Ashley, and accountable to nobody but myself if I choose to go down the well every day for the pure love of it." She walked off in her wet dress with her muddy cat. Augusta Ashley was the only girl I ever saw who could be dignified under such circumstances. I was in very bad humour with myself as I went off to see about having the well cleaned out. I had offended Gussie, and I knew she would not be easily appeased. Nor was she. For a week she kept me politely, studiously at a distance, in spite of my most humble advances. Reverend Carroll was a frequent caller, ostensibly to make arrangements about a Sunday school they were organizing in a poor part of the community. Gussie and he held long conversations on this enthralling subject. Then Gussie went on another visit to her friend, and when she came back, so did Reverend Carroll. One calm, hazy afternoon, I was coming slowly up from the mills. Happening to glance at the kitchen roof, I gasped. It was on fire in one place. Evidently the dry shingles had caught fire from a spark. There was not a soul about save Gussie, Aunt Lucy, and myself. I dashed wildly into the kitchen, where Gussie was peeling apples. "The house is on fire," I exclaimed. Gussie dropped her knife and turned pale. "Don't wake Mother," was all she said, as she snatched a bucket of water from the table. The ladder was still lying by the well. In a second I had raised it to the roof, and while Gussie went up it like a squirrel and dashed the water on the flames, I had 2 more buckets ready for her. Fortunately, the fire had made little headway, though a few minutes more would have given it a dangerous start. The flames hissed and died out as Gussie threw on the water, and in a few seconds only a small black hole in the shingles remained. Gussie slid down the ladder. She trembled in every limb, but she put out her wet hand to me with a faint, triumphant smile. We shook hands across the ladder with a cordiality never before expressed. For the next week, in spite of Reverend Carroll, I was happy when I thought of Gussie, and miserable when I thought of Nellie. I held myself in some way bound to her, and was she not my ideal? Undoubtedly. One day I got a letter from my sister. It was long and newsy, and the 8th page was most interesting. "If you don't come home and look after Nellie," wrote Kate, "you'll soon not have her to look after. You remember that old lover of hers, Rod Allen? Well, he's home from the West now, immensely rich, they say, and his attentions to Nellie are the talk of the town. I think she likes him too. If you bury yourself any longer at Ashley Mills, I won't be responsible for the consequences." This lifted an immense weight from my mind, but the 9th page held it back again. "You never say anything of Miss Ashley in your letters. What is she like? Young or old? Ugly or pretty? Clever or dull? I met a lady recently who knows her and thinks she's charming. She also said Miss Ashley was soon to be married to Reverend something or other. Is it true?" Aye, was it? Quite likely. Kate's letter made a very miserable man of me. Gussie found me a dull companion that day. After several vain attempts attempts to rouse me to interest, she gave up. "There's no use talking to you," she said impatiently. "I believe you are homesick. That letter you got this morning looked suspicious. Anyhow, I hope you'll get over it before I get back." "Are you going away again?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to stay a few days with Flossie." Flossie was that inseparable chum of hers. "You seem to spend a good deal of your time with her," I remarked discontentedly. Gussie opened her eyes at my tone. "Why, of course," she said. "Flossie and I have always been chums, and she needs me now more than ever. She's awfully busy. She is to be married next month." "Oh, I see. And you—" "I am to be bridesmaid, of course, and we've heaps to do. Flossie wanted to wait until Christmas, but Mr. Martin is in a—" "Mr. Martin," I interrupted. "Is Mr. Martin going to marry your friend?" "Why, yes. Didn't you know? They just suit each other. There he comes now. He's going to drive me over, and I'm not ready. Talk to him, for pity's sakes, while I go and dress." I never enjoyed a conversation more. Reverend Carroll Martin was a remarkably interesting man. Nellie married Rod Allen at Christmas, and I was best man. Nellie made a charming little bride, and Rod fairly worshipped her. My own wedding did not come off until spring, as Gussie said she could not get ready before that. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.